G'day everyone, let me show you how to make realistic road markings in Photoshop. My name is Hoy and in this video we'll learn how to go beyond the basics and add realism to road markings. We'll use the warp tool and a number of filters which you may not have used before, like the medium noise, distort wave and the tilt shift blur. And through all of this, we'll also learn what makes a good photo composite. So if you want to follow along, you can use the exact image that I'm using. The link is in the description. Before we get started, let's look at a sample effect that you might already seen on some of the other tutorials. I made an example already, so I'm just going to turn that on. And there are a couple of things that I like about this effect. One, the perspective of the words match this perspective of the road. So you can see that the road here converges to a point around about here, which signifies the horizon line. And you can tell that the words here also is converging towards that. The other thing I like about it is that the time that it takes to put this dirt and grime over the words is pretty quick through the blend if sliders. But let's have a look at what else we can do to improve on it. I've got some sample real life examples, which I'm just going to turn on here. I'm going to zoom in a bit and just to compare the real life road markings, which is here, to that of our one here. Now you can see straight away that the color of the real life one is not as white as the effect because of all the dirt and grime that has accumulated over the paint. Next, if I just look at the edges of the text, you can see that it's very sharp here. Look at this line here on the T, it's very sharp. The angle of the text is also sharp. But if I zoom in here, you can see that there are areas of paint which sort of bleeds onto the road and that the edges are not as crisp. Now, if I scroll across here, the letter N might highlight it a little bit more. You can see that the edges here are not as crisp. The other thing about the real life example is that it's got some depth to it. You can see here that there are shadow lines here. And that's because that there's paint caked on top of each other, giving you the 3D look. If I just scroll down to the text effect here, it's very flat. It just looks like text on a road, which basically is. So we need to add some depth to that. And the final thing doesn't relate to the real life example, so I'm just going to switch that off. I'm going to zoom out a bit. I'm just going to zoom in around about here. So the reason why I'm doing that is to compare the blur between the background and our text. You can see our text is super sharp, whereas the background's got a bit of blur. So there's some incongruence between our effect, which is super sharp, and the background, which is blurred. Let's just summarize some of the things that we need to fix in order to make this more realistic. 1, we need to fix the color. 2, we need to fix the edges and angles so it's not as sharp. 3, we need to add some depth to the words so it gives an impression that there's paint caked on top of each other. And the 4th one is to match the blur against the background. So let's get started by opening the file that's also in the description below. Let's go to File, Open, navigate to the folder where you've got your image saved under, click on the file and press Open. The first thing that we need to do is to add some text to this. So go to our text tool here, or you can press T on your keyboard. Let's type our text anywhere on the canvas, and I'm going to type stop. And if you need to make changes to your font, just select it and go to your font options here. I've got it on BBAS. You can select any font that you want. You don't have to follow me. If you also need to change the color palette is here. So just click on that and choose any color that you want. I'm choosing white and press OK. Now remember, the color that you have at the moment doesn't really matter. I'm choosing white for the time being to contrast it against the background just so I can see it. We're going to change the color anyway. I'm going to commit that change by pressing this check mark here. And I'm just going to resize it because it's so tiny here. So Command T on the keyboard, that will bring out the transformation handles. Let's resize it proportionally by pressing Shift on your keyboard and then dragging this out. something like this will look fine, and press return on your keyboard just to commit that change. The next thing that we'll do is round the edges. As we said before, the edges are too sharp. Let's go to Filter, Noise, and Median Noise. Now it's going to ask us whether we want to convert our layer to Smart Object or rasterize it. Now what a Smart Object is basically a wrapper that protects your original object, in our case, the text. So when you make any effects on it, you can change the settings of those effects later. If you rasterize it, which is this option here, that means that the effect that you apply to the text are burnt into the pixels, so you can't change them later. The most that you can do is simply undo all those changes. Now you might be thinking, why wouldn't we choose Smart Object in all the cases? And in a lot of the cases we do. But the one thing to consider is that Smart Objects increases the file size because it has to maintain the original text or object that you've made as a Smart Object. In our case, we've only got one simple layer, so yes, it's going to increase the file size, but it's not going to be that much of a concern. So let's convert to Smart Object here, and it's going to bring this median dialog box up. Let's make sure that you've got preview selected, and I'm just going to dial the radius down just to make sure that we start from the beginning and that you can see the effect that it has. So just look at any corner here, or well, any corner anywhere, but I'm going to look at that corner somewhere around the bottom of the P here, and I'm going to slide the radius from the left to the right. And as I do so, the corners will be rounded like so. Now if I go to the extreme, it's going to distort a little bit. You can see here it's starting to distort. Obviously we don't want that effect, so I'm going to dial it back somewhere around the low 40s, something like that. Now let's see the before and after. This is before, after, before, after. Now I'm okay with that, so let's press OK. Now the next step is to add the waviness to the straight lines. Remember, our real life examples didn't have straight edges. It was wavy. So we'll use another filter for that effect, and that's called the wave filter. So let's go to Filter, Distort even, and go to Wave. And this dialog has many options here, and before we adjust it, I want to explain what all these things do. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and I'm going to go back to our example layer here, and I'm going to use this rectangle to demonstrate what the wave filter does. So let's go to Filter, Distort, and Wave. Now I'm going to just max out everything just for demonstration purposes. Now I've reset the settings so we just see one wave. Let's start off with the number of generators. You can think of the number of generators as the number of waves you're going to generate. Here I've got it 1, which means that there will be one wave generated. So you can see here that there is one wave generated here from this straight rectangle here. Now over here, it's asking what is the type of wave we want. Now I'm not going to go too technical. All you need to know is that for the sine wave, it's got a curvy tops and bottom. And for the triangle wave, then it's a bit sharper. The ups and downs, the crests and the troughs are a bit angular, more angular I should say. And square, you can see that the crest and the troughs of the waves are just represented by these rectangles here. For our effect, we'll change it back to sine, which is the wavy curve here. Now, if I increase the number of generators, which is the number of waves we're going to have, it's just going to amplify that wave. So I'm going to press up on my keyboard, and you can see that the waves are increasingly amplified. I'm going to reduce that down all the way to 2. Just to highlight a caveat, the reason why it's doing that is because I've maxed out the wavelength and the amplitude. If there are variances to the wavelength and the amplitude, we'll get a different result. So with the minimum here, I'm just going to slide it somewhere to the center here, and I'm going to leave the max here. And there you see a preview of the wave is distorted. So let's just go through what's happened here. we're saying generate 2 waves here, but the 2 waves will be different wavelengths. So instead of amplifying the 2 identical waves so you can get an amplified wave, you have one wave with a different profile and another wave with another profile smashing into each other, which produces this distorted wave. Now, I deliberately used the word profile because I wanted to avoid the words wavelength and amplitude because I'm going to define that later. So just to drive that home, if I increase the number of generators or the number of waves to 3, it will give us another wave. And again, that means that there's 3 waves of different profiles, different shapes that is smashing into each other, and that produces this outcome here. What wavelength is the distance between the height of the wave, the crest, from here to here. It could also be the bottoms, so from the trough here to the next trough here. So if I reduce the minimum, the wavelength, the distance between the tops and the bottoms will reduce, as you can see here. And if I do that for the maximum, it will also reduce. The amplitude is the distance between the height of the wave and halfway. Alternatively, it's also the distance between the bottom of the wave to halfway. So basically, it's the height of the wave. So if I reduce the minimum of that, the wave will slowly decrease in height, like so. You can think of the scale as the master controls for wavelength and amplitude. So at the moment, vertical scale, as in what impacts up and down, is switched to 100. So I'm feeling 100% of this wavelength and amplitude here, but I've only got 1% on the horizontal. So there's minimal impact on what's happening horizontally. If I switch this all the way to the right, the horizontal wave will come out both on this side as well as this side. But if I reduce both the horizontal scale and the vertical scale, it means that I'm going to switch off both wavelength and amplitude. So let's just do that just to see what happens. So here, we've returned it almost back to the beginning as a rectangle. I can't return it exactly to the beginning because the minimum values for horizontal scale and vertical scale is 1%. So now that we've got a better understanding of what the wave dialog does, I'm going to cancel out of that. I'm going to go back to my image here and let's apply the filter. Let's go to Filter, Distort, and Wave. Now you can copy my settings here. Now for the last input on vertical scale, make sure you press Tab to register the effect. In my experience, if you don't press Tab, the effect on the vertical scale doesn't happen. I'm going to press OK to accept the changes. And let's just have a peek about what it's actually done. Now you can see that it has put some wave in here. What I want to do is to add more minute waves to add to the realism. So let's go back to Filter, Distort, and Wave. Now again, you can copy my settings. Now for vertical scale, remember to press Tab just to make sure that it's registered the change. And unfortunately, I can't give you a universal setting that will apply to every single project. Every single project will be different. But now that you understand what the wave dialog does, you can just have a play around with different settings. If you need a refresher of what the wave dialog does, simply just go back and review it again. Let's press OK to accept the changes. Let's just see what it's done. I'm going to turn off the wave effect. Now this is the most recent wave effect that we did, and this is the first one. Let's turn off the effect. And the change is subtle, but it's the accumulation of multiple subtle effects that add to the realism instead of one big effect. I'm going to turn it back on just so you can see the difference again. And that's with the wave effect. Let's zoom out to take stock of our image. Command 0 on our keyboard. The next thing that we need to do is to add perspective to this text. So we're going to make a copy of this text. So clicking on this layer here, press Command and click on this layer. This will bring the marching ants out so you know that it's selected. And we're going to make a copy of that by pressing Command C. And now that we've got it in our clipboard, we're going to deselect that by pressing Command D. Let's make a new layer by pressing this icon here and drag it between these layers here. Let's turn off this layer here and then go to Filter, Vanishing Point. Make sure you've got Create Plane Tool selected, and then align your cursor to where this road marking is, so somewhere off the canvas like this, and then just follow the road markings along there to make our perspective. Click once here, and I'm going to click once here. Now you can see that I've got a blue grid here, which means that Photoshop is saying that they can work with this perspective. If you have something red, and I'm going to simulate that by just ruining my grid, this is red, which means that Photoshop is saying that this perspective won't work. Please try again. The other colored grid that you might see is yellow. So something like this. And what that means is that Photoshop may be able to do something with this perspective, but it's not the best perspective. What you really want to do is to make sure that your perspective grid is blue. So I'm going to return it to blue, and I'm going to stretch this down like this so it covers the whole image. Let's paste the text onto this picture here and press Command-T to bring up the transformation controls. I'm going to resize this, and I'm going to make sure it's proportionally resized by pressing Shift on my keyboard, and something like this will do. I'm going to drag this all the way down here, and it's just a little bit too big, so I'm going to resize it while it's in perspective. So clicking on this control here and pressing Shift on my keyboard, I'm just going to drag it to a size that's suitable. Something like this. I'm going to just drag it to the middle here. And once I've got it in position, let's press OK. The next step is to blend the color of this word here to the line markings here. So as you can see, the word is very bright white compared to the line marking, which is sort of grayish here. So let's select our eyedropper tool here, or you can press I on your keyboard. Make sure that your sample size is 3x3 average. And what that means is that wherever you select, Photoshop will make a selection 3 pixels wide by 3 pixels high and average the color out and use that as your color. Make sure that your sample is current and below, and then zoom into somewhere that should be wide, something like this. I've pressed Option on my keyboard and scroll wheel mouse up, and I'm just going to select somewhere here as my white point. That will change our foreground color to this sort of light brownish color here. Let's zoom out by pressing Command-0 on our keyboard to take stock of our image. Let's select the text by pressing Command-click on the thumbnail, and you know that is selected because of these marching ants here. Let's apply the color by pressing Option and Delete on our keyboard and deselect that by pressing Command-D. The next step is to apply a Blend If slider to make the grime and dirt appear on top of this word now. Before we do that, let's make a smart object out of this by right-clicking on the empty area and selecting Convert to Smart Object. Now remember, you know that is a smart object because of this icon here. Let's now apply the Blend If slider by double-clicking on this empty area here. Now these are the sliders that we'll use, the Blend If slider, and specifically we'll use the underlying layer slider. To make the dark tones from the background shine up through the words, we're going to use this point here. So let's slide it from the left to the right. And slowly the black points or the darker areas will shine through. Let's just explain what it's doing at the moment. So it's saying that from here to where the slider is, all these dark areas will start to appear on top of this layer here. Let's zoom in a bit so we can see what's going on here. Option on my keyboard and scroll wheel mouse up. Now these edges are pretty hard. I'm going to feather the edges by breaking this tab here. Let's press Option on our keyboard and click once here, and that will break the slider, and I'm going to slide the half slider to the right again. You notice on the bottom the effect that it has. So what this is doing is making the edges of the dark tones a bit more fuzzy, a bit softer. So I'm just going to adjust it a bit more and press OK. Once again, let's take stock of our image by pressing Command-0 on our keyboard to see it in full. The next step is to create the shadow for this text. Make sure that your layer 1 is selected, and we'll rename this so we don't get confused to stop and press return on our keyboard. To duplicate it, let's press Command J on our keyboard, and let's rename this stop copy to shadow. I'm just going to drag this down here. And what you can see is that because we have two layers of the same thing on top of each other, the colors have intensified. So let's just see by turning the visibility off and then back on. This is what we don't want. So let's turn off the fill by sliding it from 100 to all the way to 0. That will give us no fill. So if I turn off this layer, basically the whole thing's disappeared. And the reason why we do that is because we still want the text there, because we want the shape of it to create the shadow. Let's turn back this layer on and double click on this to bring up the layer style menu. What we would like to use is the drop shadow here. So make sure you click on the word drop shadow, not this checkbox here. If you only click on the checkbox, you won't see all these options here. You will simply apply whatever settings that you've got already. Now I've had to play around with it before, so you can copy these settings. With the color of the shadow, we don't want a solid black. To make it more realistic, we should use the color of the shadow in the image. I'm going to move this layer style menu out of the way here, and I'm going to zoom in to this person here because there is just a light shadow underneath her foot here by pressing Option and scroll wheel mouse up. And then click on this color option here. Move this out of the way. I'm going to click here on the shadow to get the color of the existing shadow. Now, I'm not sure whether it's showing up, but the shadow is not a pure black shadow. You can see that by the color here. It's not all the way down here. Let's press OK here. I'm going to just move that back up and press OK here. I'm going to pan down just to see the effects of my shadow. Zoom out by pressing Option, scroll wheel mouse down. And just going to pan across again. And this is my shadow effect here. Just to see it a bit more clearer, I'm going to move my layer panel a bit further up and turn the drop shadow off and on, off and on. And that gives us some feeling of depth. So while we're adding realism one bit at a time with each effect that we're applying, it's still not realistic. We want to give the impression that there are layers of paint caked on top of each other. And what we're going to do is just manipulate or move the shadows around just to give that illusion that there are layers of paint on top of each other. I'm going to zoom out by pressing Command 0 on my keyboard to take stock of the image. And now we're going to use the warp tool on the shadow to give us the illusion of paint layered on top of each other. Make sure that your shadow layer is selected and bring out your transform controls by pressing Command T on your keyboard. Go to your warp tool, make sure custom is selected. And what we're going to do here is just to warp the shadow. So let's zoom in and see what we need to do. So if I drag my cursor around, you can see that the shadow layer has moved on top of that. And if I just sort of make my movements, I can give it the impression that there is layers on top of layers. But in reality, all we're doing is moving the shadows. However, one issue is that if I move it around, the whole thing moves. And it gives it a uniform look, which doesn't provide a realistic effect. What I want is little bits of these shadows to be moving and not the whole piece moving. So I'm going to undo that. To only affect a small section of a shadow, we have to make additional meshes. So press Command on your keyboard and this will come out. So depending on where your cursor is, you either see a crosshair like this, or if you're near the top, you only see one line. If you're near a vertical line, you'll see these. So just move your cursor around to see more cross lines. So if I want to make a small section here, I've got Command pressed on my keyboard and I'm going to click here. So if I move a point around here, it's just going to affect that point. So I'm going to make as many warping points that I need to make that effect. And all I'm doing is nudging the shadows a little bit by little bit, just to give the impression that there's another layer behind it. Now remember, subtlety is the key. Once you're fine with your changes, you can confirm that by pressing this check mark here. Now let's zoom in to take stock of what we've done. And what we've done is to adjust the shadow so it appears that there is something else underneath it, so it's not as flat as it seems. Now I've only done a very quick adjustment of my warp effect. For your image, please take the time to make it as perfect as you want it. If you need to make any adjustment after you've already confirmed your change, just select your shadow layer here and press Command T on the keyboard and press this warp tool here. I'm going to zoom out and that will show you the original settings that I've warped it to. Once you've made any further adjustments that you need to make, press this check mark here again. Let's fit this to screen by pressing Command 0 on our keyboard. Now the final thing we need to do is to match the blur of our text to the background. So if I zoom in here by pressing Option on the keyboard and scroll wheel mouse up, you can see that the line marking is blurred, but our text is still very sharp. I'm going to zoom out again and we'll make sure that your stop layer is selected. Go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and we'll use the tilt shift blur. Before we use this, let's quickly explain what the tilt shift blur does. Now I'm just going to reduce the lines here just so you can see it a bit better. And you can see that there's 4 lines. The first is a dotted line, solid, solid, and then dotted line. And what it's showing is that between these solid lines here and here, there'll be no blur applied. From this line to the next dotted line, it's saying that it will gradually go from 0 blur all the way up to the blur that you've selected. The blur that you've selected is here, so it's 15 pixels. So what it means is that from here to here, it will gradually go from 0 to 15 pixels blur, and beyond the dotted line, it will be 15 pixels blur. The similar applies to the bottom here. So from here to here, it's a blur of 0, gradually increasing to 15. And beyond this dotted line, it will be 15 pixels continuously. I'm going to move this down by clicking on the eyeballs here. And by putting this dotted line below the text here, it's saying that I want everything at 15% blur. So let's zoom in just to check the blur value here. And all I'm doing is eyeballing, does this blur on the line marking here match the blur here? And to my eye, it does. If it doesn't, you can adjust the blur here. When you're happy with the amount of blur that you've applied, press OK to commit that change. So let's just turn the blur effect off just to see the effect it has. So this is without the blur and this is with the blur. Let's zoom in again just to see the detail, and you can see that it has smudged the edge a bit. It's left the shadow somewhat intact, but you can see the underlying paint here, which gives it a little bit more realism. Let's zoom out to take stock of what we've got. Command 0 on our keyboard, and at a distance it doesn't look like we've done much, but if you zoom in you can see the details all around here. And remember, it's the multiple layers of subtlety that adds realism and that improves your skill as a Photoshopper. And there you have it, how to make realistic road markings in Photoshop. Let's review what we've learned so far. I'm going to turn off the visibility of these layers and go back to the image that we started with. First, we created a text layer and applied the wave effect and the median noise effect to blunt out the edges and make some waves across the text here. We learned what the wave dialog was, what generators were, wavelength, amplitude, sine, triangle, and square waves. We then put the text into perspective by using the Vanishing Point filter. We changed the color of the text and used the Blend If slider to bring out the darker tones to pierce through the text layer. We then created a shadow layer to make it seem as if the text had more depth to it. We then warp the shadow so it doesn't quite fit the text to give it the illusion that there is paint on top of paint. The last thing that we did was added a blur using the tilt shift blur filter. We also learned that to make a good photo composite, it's the details that matter. It's the multiple layers of subtlety that makes a photo or image more realistic. So I hope you found this useful. Thanks so much for watching. And as a small YouTuber who's just started out, I do everything from scratch, from coming up with the idea for the tutorial, creating the thumbnails and captions, all of which takes time. So if you learn something new, please consider liking and subscribing and hit the bell icon so you can get notified for when the next video is out.